Hey folks, what's going on? Today we're going to have fun looking at this little experiment that I had to do myself recently, and I thought this would be a great thing to talk about for all the viewers out there for a couple of reasons. And one fun fact is I am doing this on the Mac version of TouchDesigner, just like I was saying in our previous video about the Mac version of TouchDesigner. It's pretty great. And this just goes to show that it can do a lot of complicated things when it comes to TouchDesigner development and interactive projects. So what we're going to do today is essentially create this render picking based version of the arcgeo component inside of the palette. Now that's a lot of words, so we're going to break those down little by little. And what this video is really about is this idea that a lot of times when you're working on professional projects, there may or may not be tools that completely suit the needs of everything that you're working on. A lot of the times there are going to be things that are pretty close, or things that are just one feature short of what you need them to be. And you're often wondering, should I start from the beginning and make something from the ground up? Or should I just try and hack together from what pieces I already have? And being able to hack together different pieces of existing tools, templates, and similar to make them do what you need to do is actually a great skill to have as a professional in this industry, especially when these tools are readily available and free for us to use, like a lot of the things inside of the palette. Now, inside of the palette here, if I open up my palette window, which I realize that you can't see right now, but inside of the tools area, there is something called the arcball geometry. And this is really cool because what it does is it gives you a kind of, exactly like we're seeing here that we're going to build, this ability to have a 3D object in the environment that you can kind of, similar to how you might do in a game engine or another 3D application, just be able to click and drag and tumble around that object. Now this can be a really helpful feature that you might want to use in a lot of projects, but there's one tricky part about how this arcgeo works, and that is that it's fully panel based. Now normally being fully panel based is not the end of the world, but once you start working on bigger projects, you want to be able to have a little bit more finite control over what things are causing interactions, what interactions they're causing, or you may be wanting to have this ability of what we're going to do here with this arcgeo on multiple different pieces of geometry in a single rendered environment. And all of that is really not possible with the current way that this is set up, because if we go inside of this arcball geometry here, and don't worry, we're going to delete this, start from scratch, and build it all again. But just to give you a quick little overview of this component, this arcgeo element here is where all the brains of this operation are. Outside of it are kind of just a regular rendered environment. This is going to be things that we're going to add down here for our render picking. So this arcgeo is really the brains of the environment. And if we go inside, we're going to see a lot of it actually works on one, there's a little keyboard indat here, which is catching some keyboard shortcuts just to kind of reset things. There's also a panel execute here, which is grabbing the second parent, so not the direct parent, which is this arcgeo geometry, but the parent above that, which is a container. It's grabbing the panel interactions with that container and feeding them into this long extension full of fun Python goodness. Now, we don't have to understand the whole extension, and this is why this ability to be able to quickly hack together tools is really fun for some people, horrible nightmare for other people, but equally important skill for both of those types of people. Because we want to be able to go in there without having to even understand most of the complexity of this tool, be able to steal its functionality and work it into our own system. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and delete this arcball geometry here. I'm going to use the palette, which you can't see because I'm using application capture. I'm just going to drag in a brand new arcball geometry in here. Now, what you're going to see in the standard arcball geometry is that wherever I click and drag inside of this geometry, whether it's on the torus, the sphere itself, or the block, I am getting the exact same interaction because this version by default is not based on a render picking approach. It's based on just how we're interacting with this container. So if I want to go ahead and start with render picking, I love render picking. It's such a useful technique because what it's going to allow us to do is use the same functionality, but be much more specific in how we use it. So we can set up a system like I did previously, which is that only by clicking and dragging the torus are we going to perform our tumble in 3D. And that way, clicking on the sphere or the block are not going to instigate tumble actions for us. So if I want to start this, the first thing I usually do is set up the things around my complex environment. So the things that are easy, that I know how they're going to work, at least just to get them set up so I can start prototyping quickly. So in this case, before I even go and start interacting with my ArcGeo component and all of its Python, I'm just going to set up my render picking environment. So I'm just going to make a new container here as just like a really easy place I can test and drag. If you're working on a bigger project, this render might go to a master user interface that has a container in there that holds the render, and that would be where we're going to pull our interaction data from. I'm then going to go ahead and create a multi-touch in DAT, which is usually a very good thing to have feeding into a render pick DAT, because what it can do is look at this container that I have here and grab all of its interactions as nice data points that feed very easily into that render pick DAT. The one thing I'm going to do in this multi-touch in is I'm going to click on the include mouse button, which then means as I go inside of this container, and you can see if I zoom in here, if I zoom in and start interacting, I can see all the data points inside of that table changing, such as the U, V, the X position, the select going from 0 to 1. So all of that beautiful data is going to feed right into my render pick DAT. So I can go ahead and make that render pick DAT next. Now it needs two things, one of which is the table of interactions, so I can plug in that multi-touch in. And the second thing is that it needs its render pass or render top or render pass top. So in this case, I can go grab this render and drag and drop it onto that parameter there. So now what I'm going to see is, well, actually first, and the last thing I should do here is connect my render as the background of the container so I can actually see what I'm clicking on here. So I can grab that render, drag and drop it onto the container, and set it as the parm background top. Now we're going to see it's going to be a little bit stretched and squished here. So I just have to update the width and height of my container here to match the 1280 by 720 resolution of my render. So I'll go ahead and update that. And now is where the fun starts to begin, because what I can do is activate my container here. And as I start to click on different elements inside of this 3D environment, I can see that the render pick DAT is picking them up, telling me information about which geometry it is, where that position is in 3D space. And what we're going to be using is that it's actually triggering the callbacks inside of the render pick 1 callbacks. So all of that sounds good so far, and we've started to get our system set up so that now that we're going to start to hack our ArcGeo component, we have the ability to send test signals to it, try different things, have fun, throw errors, all of that good stuff. So in a lot of times when I'm trying to work with components like this ArcGeo or anything similar, whether it's visual effects, utility functions, I find the easiest way to approach it is how can I hack the control scheme that it already has set up to do what I want without me having to learn its internals. So this is really important with something like the ArcGeo, because if I come down here and look at the actual arcball extension here, I can activate this viewer and I can see, it's not huge, but it's still about 130 lines of Python. There's elements about matrices in here, auto rotations, and to be honest, I really don't want to deal with it. So I don't even have to look inside of the main elements here. What I'm going to start looking at is how is the rest of TouchDesigner by default interfacing with this code. Now, I can take a look at maybe this parameter execute here, but I can see it only has about 2 or 3 lines of code here. All of them seem to have something to do with auto rotate and resetting, so I can rule that out, which is great. I always say the more you can rule out, the easier it's going to be to find what you want to rule in. I can look at this panel execute 2 here, and I can see that this is while off, and it seems to be doing something about getting some channel data. And then I can see here a good clue for myself is if the slope doesn't equal 0 and parent.par.auto-rotate. So even though I don't have full understanding of the code, I can tell that this code really is just going to be running while the auto-rotate functionality is on. And it looks like when the L select in the panel execute dat is set to off. So what that's starting to tell me is that when nobody is clicking on this component, if the auto rotate is on, and if there is a slope value, it's going to be performing some action. Now that's great because I don't plan to be worrying about auto rotate. I want to be doing my real interactions. So I can see then there's the keyboard element here, and it looks like all it has is capturing the key H for resetting. Okay, great, don't need that. So already just by this process of elimination, I've ruled out all 4 of these surrounding DATs and scripts as things I don't need to worry about. So everything really is probably going to be inside of this panel execute 1. And I can see in the panel values it's looking for L select, R select, M select, and the U and V, which is great because now I'm starting to figure out, okay, so this is looking at the left, middle, and right mouse button and clicks. It's getting the UV positions from those interactions. Great, so I know those are going to be things that I'm going to want to hack. I can also see that it has a off to on turned on and a while on turned on, which is starting to make sense for me because the original way that it works is as you kind of click and drag, you are going to be interacting with that 3D geometry. So now I'm starting to get real warm here. And what I can do is, I always say when you're looking at code that you're not familiar with, don't be afraid to just skim it. You know, we don't have to understand what every single line does. We don't have to understand what every value is. We can a lot of the time skim the code to get a general understanding of it and then just start picking the pieces out that we want. So for example, when I'm skimming code like this, I would look at it and say, you know what? Looks like there's a bunch of values it's getting at the top. It's making some kind of decision based on those. And then it looks like it's checking for something in the name of the value. And then if it's a correct condition of some sort, it's starting transform. Great, so I don't even need to worry about the rest of this code, but I can now start to map in my brain that when off to on goes on in the correct situation, this parent.arcball.start transform with its arguments is how the original component was engaging the first element of this arcgeo. Now the nice thing is a lot of this code looks the same, so I can look at the while on, which in our cases of the original functionality, this component would be while it's dragging. I can see it's grabbing a bunch of, parent information and values, doing a weird control-shift check here, which I still don't know what it does, and then really just checking a couple of if statements before, and here's another good pattern, is we're starting to look for patterns here, before it does the parent.arcball.transform and sends some information into it. Great. So now if I start to think about this mapping of when the click goes down first, we do our arcball start transform. While we're dragging, we're doing arcball transforms every frame. So now these are things that I can set up inside of my render picking, and I'm probably going to come back and just directly copy these 2 lines of code, put them inside of if statements in my render picking, and then just do what I normally do, which is find values that are equivalent to the ones that are feeding in already, or just overwrite or hard code some of them, and really take control of this operator. So I'm going to go back up a level here to my render picking, and I'm going to come down inside of my render pick callbacks here, and I'm going to just put in 2 conditions to look for similar conditions of this original component. So the first was when the first click interaction happens, that's the start transform, and then while it's dragging, it's sending the transform. Now, the render pick is great because it has such a feature-rich, detail-rich amount of data that comes in with every event. If you've never worked with it before, this is probably going to be a little bit of a fun exercise, but we essentially have a for loop here, and inside of this for loop, specifically this event object, is going to give us all of this data every single frame for every single action happening. So that could be multi-touch, that could be single touch, really great for scaling interactions as well. So that means if I wanted to get an element like the U or the V, I could go into my event object inside of this for loop and say event.u, event.v, and I have that specific interactions U and V value on that specific frame. So that's great because as we can see, event also has these different select states. So I can do event.select, which is going to give me true when the selection is ongoing, event.select start, true at the start of a selection, and event.select end, which is true at the end of the selection. At this point, the alarm bells in my head are ringing. Hey, those first 2 sounded like exactly like what I need. So I could even just start some simple if statements here, and I can say if event.select start, print starting my interaction. And these are just placeholders. We're going to replace these print statements. And then what I can do is do an elif and say elif event.select. So now the first condition catches if it's the first interaction. Otherwise, it's going to catch every other select active interaction and say interaction is active. Great, so I can even just go ahead and split my screen here to get a little text port. Ooh, let's resize this. Great, so now if I go and interact with the container that I made here, I can start to see that when I first click, I'm going to get starting my interaction, and then while my mouse button is held down, for every frame, I'm going to get interaction is active. So I can see if I click and drag, starting my interaction, interaction is active. So I've already started to match the states of the interaction that the existing component had, which really a lot of the time is about 70 to 80% of the battle, because spoofing data is very easy, but matching the state of interactions is usually the harder part of this process. So now that I have that mapped and kind of matching in that same kind of functionality, I can say, okay, well, what is going to go inside of these if statements? I can go back to my code here for the arcgeo, and inside of my panel execute, I saw that parent.arcball.start transform with a bunch of arguments. Great, let's rip it out. So I'm going to copy that, go back out here, and don't worry, this process, you always get errors in these processes. Your first run of the code is never going to work, but that's okay because we fix errors one by one and we get to our mission complete status. So I'm going to just paste that exact line, parent.arcball.start transform. Now the first thing I can do is already just replace the reference of the operator. I don't need to go to parent.arcball. I know that what I'm targeting is op arcgeo here. So regardless of whether it would work or not, doesn't really matter. I'm just going to replace it and simplify my life. Op arcgeo.start transform. Now again, I can just start doing a little bit of data spoofing or matching. I don't know what button is, so we're gonna have to go back in the code and check out what that is, but I know that I can get a U and V value inside of my event. So in this case, instead of U just being equal to U, I know that if I want the U of my current event from the render pick, it's actually gonna be event.U. Same with my V, it's gonna be event.V, because all of these event.selectStart, event.U, and event.V elements belong to the event object, which we can see a little bit of its documentation up here. So now the last thing that I need really to get this start transform working is to figure out what is button. So I can go back and look at my code a little bit, and this time I can start to, instead of skimming everything, I can start to think about, okay, well, what is button name? And in this case, I'm looking for this button, which is value name. So I start to just scroll up and I start to see, okay, well, if value name not in UV, okay, so already I can start making some connections here. If not in UV, I start to think about the panel execute had L select, R select, M select, U and V. So I'm starting to guess that the button here is talking about the mouse button. Is it L select, R select, or M select? And I can see if I keep scrolling up, value name is the panel value.name. And in this case, if we look at our off to on code, panel value is an argument that TouchDesigner already feeds into our panel execute, and it's the panel value object that changed. So in this case, if I was to click, I'm going to get L select or R select if I right click as the panel value.name. So I've already confirmed for myself that L select, R select, or M select, which is the left click, middle click, or right click. Can't remember if those last two are in the right order or not, but it's essentially wanting this name to feed into the code directly. Now in this case, because of what we're doing, and because we don't want the video to last 10 million hours long, we're just going to force it to be L select, because L select is the tumbling mechanic. The middle click and the right click were things like panning and zooming, which if you want to add are a great exercise to add in yourself. But what we know is that in this case, I want all of my clicks to just pretend to be left clicks going into this code here. So I can say L select. Now, before I test to see if this works, which is often a bad but fun habit I have, which is doing a bunch of code before testing any of it, I'm actually going to copy the second element of code as well and just get both of those set up for testing. So I'm going to go back into my arcgeo. So now I have unconfidently but hopefully replicated this functionality in some format inside of my code. So really now I need to get the arcball.transform, which is for every frame of further interaction after the first one. So I'm going to do a similar thing. I'm just going to go ahead and copy this line, come back to my render pick, and I'm going to overwrite that print statement with my code. And I'm just going to do a lot of really similar things. I'm going to overwrite the operator here with my op arcgeo.transform. I know my u and v are going to be event.u and event.v. I know my button name, just like we did before. We're just going to overwrite it with a hard-coded L-select. Now in this case, I have to get what this scalar scale amount is. So this is a new data point. I can go back and do the same kind of little investigation. I can come down to here and I can say scalar equals scale amount. So let me find scale amount. So it looks like scale amount is based on whether it's L select, R select, or M select, gives me a different amount here. And it looks like L select gives us rot amount. So rotation amount is what I'm guessing there, but I can keep even scrolling further up in the code. And it looks like rot amount is parent.par.rot_mult. So what does that mean? That means I can then, from my render picking code, just directly reference this same parameter. So I know this is on the parent of this arcgeo. So if I go up a level, it's here, and it's this rotate multiplier. Great, so from my render pick, I can just directly reference that piece of data. So I'm going to zoom in here, and where I have scale amount, I'm going to delete that, and I'm going to put op arcgeo.par.rot_mult. So now essentially I really have most of the functionality to at least replicate the same functionality I had before. So I could say left click and drag on my container. So remember, this is the container hooked up to my render pick, not the container hooked up to those panel executes. And I can see left clicking and dragging works like a charm, does exactly what the other version of this was doing. So now this is where the fun kind of begins, and where by all means do whatever you feel is most fun here or whatever your project demands. But we've essentially started to control this tool that had pre-existing functionality with a pre-existing interface with our own custom interface, and now we can start to add our custom functionality. So I could say only operate this when we click and drag from the torus and not from the sphere and from the cube. So the first thing I would do is look at this torus, select it inside of my container here so I can look at my render pick, and I can see that this is Geo2. And I can even just look at the other elements as well. So I can click on the cube. That looks like Geo1, and the sphere is Geo3. So I could even simply just add an additional if statement that checks to see if Geo2 is inside of the path of this kind of selected object. If yes, do my transformations. If no, ignore everything that's happening on screen. So again, I could come inside of my render pick here, and I have event.selectStart, but I can also look down and see event.pickOp is going to give me the currently picked operator. Great, so that's going to tell me who I'm interacting with inside of that 3D environment. So I can say if event.selectStart and event.pickOp. Now in this case, what I want to do is check if the string that I have, which is Geo2, the name of my object, is inside of the path of that pickup. What I would do is say and Geo2 in event.pickop.path. And we know we can do this pickop.path because pickop, if I look here, is going to return to us the type operator. So this is just like if I typed op arcgeo.path or op constant1.path. If I type event.pickop, I have a live operator object that I can do a .path on. So in this case, I'm saying if event.selectStart and Geo2, this little string, is inside of the path of event.pickop, do my start transform. And honestly, I could probably copy and paste that into the second if statement as well. So otherwise, elif event.select and Geo2 in event.pickop.path, then do my transform. And as simple as that little addition, Now we can see if I click and drag with my torus here, I'm interacting. But if I start to click and drag with the other objects, I'm not able to control that. Now you're going to see some elements here because if I try and click in the background, there's no pick op path, but you can obviously make your code nicer and more resilient to bugs like that. Now, the important thing here is I hope this was a fun way for you to see how a pro might approach a problem that you probably experience in your daily project life, which is that you're approaching some kind of problem and you probably have a bunch of tools that are all kind of close in different ways, but you can't decide whether I should still start from scratch and make this tool myself, or is it possible for me to go and grab one of these pre-existing tools and maybe either hack the interface or take over the control scheme or reuse a lot of the functionality. And this is something that pros go through too. And I had to go through this experience recently with the ArcGL, and I thought it'd be a great example to show you of taking a component that has a great bit of functionality in its extension, but uses a panel-based interaction method, which just wouldn't work on a more complicated project, and how I approached using render picking to then take over that control scheme. Enjoy. Hey guys, thanks for watching. If you're serious about taking your TouchDesigner and interactive skills to the next level, I highly recommend you check out the Interactive and Immersive HQ Pro. It's the only educational resource and community of its kind for TouchDesigner and interactive professionals. You can learn more by checking out the link in the description. And if you like this video, don't forget to hit that like button. And if you're new here, don't forget to hit subscribe and the little bell icon for more awesome free content.